And joining us now on the debate in Boston, Massachusetts, Bill Fowler, Distinguished Professor of History at Northeastern University. And with us here in studio, Peter McLeod, pre-Confederation historian at the Canadian War Museum and curator of the new exhibit 1812, and Rick Hill, chairperson of the Six Nations Legacy Consortium. Good to have all of you around our table here in Toronto. And Bill, thanks for joining us on the line from Boston, Massachusetts, as we like to call it.
My pleasure.
I want to start.
Thank you for inviting me.
Nice accent, incidentally, and don't tell me what accent. I love that New England accent. It's terrific. I want to start by just getting everybody to weigh in on what was at stake. We have, obviously, an American representative, a Canadian representative, and an Aboriginal representative, which were three of the main groups involved in this conflict 200 years ago. So, Bill, start us off here. What was at stake for the Americans in this war?
Well, initially, of course, I think national honor more than anything else. The causes of the war, impressment, Western expansion, British orders in council, all of those were aggravations. None of them, though, threatened the national existence of the United States. And so the United States went to war in June of 1812 out of anger and out of a sense of defending our national honor.
What was at stake, Peter, for British North Americans? We weren't, of course, technically, we weren't Canadians yet, were we?
Well, in terms of the broader conflict, nothing at all. The war is between the British Empire and the United States. No one is that concerned about Canada. But in terms of Canadians in the long run, the question is, are we going to stay Canadians or become Americans?
And Rick, how about for Aboriginal, I was going to say Aboriginal Canadians, but they weren't that at the time either.
I think the Native nations were fighting for their right to exist on their own land under their own law. So it was a multinational group of Native people, both in Canada and the United States, really fighting for the same issue. It's just they ended up fighting each other over that issue.
And as we heard in the previous interview, there were First Nations in Canada who fought First Nations in the United States, and it got ugly, didn't it?
Yes, in fact, my father's a Mohawk from Six Nations, and my mother's a Tuscarora from New York. So in reality, my father's relatives fought against my mother's relatives in this war, and sometimes they kept the argument going most of their life.
So it was a civil war. I know that's a bit controversial in some circles, but from your standpoint, I guess it would have been.
Yeah, it's a very internal issue, and choosing sides was risky for everybody, but particularly for the First Nations, who would best be able to defend the positions that we were putting forth.
Bill, I know this is an oversimplification, but let me try it anyway. You know, Canadians have basically been taught in school for, almost 200 years, I guess, that this was essentially a war where you guys invaded us, and 2.5 years later, it was over. But I want you to help us put this into a broader historical context. How important is it to link the events of 200 years ago with what preceded it?
Well, the war itself, the War of 1812, is in many ways, as seen by Americans, as sort of a continuation after a long interim of the American Revolution. From the time 1783 forward, the Treaty of Paris in 1783, His Majesty was not kind to us and did everything possible to harass us in a number of ways, eventually through impressment, through the orders in council, and through assisting Native Americans in attacking Western American settlements. And so this was a kind of a growing aggravation. And then we have in our own country, in the Congress, early in our republic, a group of men elected to Congress, most of them from the frontier areas, who become known collectively as war hawks. These are men who are very much imbued with a rising sense of American nationalism. And so when you stir all of these things together, you find that that's why we declared war on Great Britain, which of course in retrospect seems an enormous element of chutzpah. At the time, our entire Navy was less than 24 ships, barely 10 frigates and a few brigs. We had virtually no army at all, and here we were defending, attacking, declaring war against the world's greatest superpower.
Bill, just curious, do you think Thomas Jefferson and James Madison would have referred to it as an enormous act of chutzpah?
Well, I'm not sure. Jefferson plays an interesting role in this, of course, as you probably know, in as much as Jefferson, well, not a pacifist, that would be a mistaken notion. Jefferson did everything he could in a peaceful, economic way to keep America out of war. Madison, of course, was a little bit more belligerent. Mr. Madison's War on this side of the border is often how we refer to the War of 1812. So I'm not sure whether Jefferson would have thought of it as chutzpah. I always remember the words of John Randolph, a congressman from Virginia, as the war was being debated. Randolph stood up in the well of the House and cried out, "I hear a whippoorwill whistling, whistling, crying, 'Canada, Canada, Canada.'" So for many in the Congress, this was seen as a war of aggression. This was a war in which we were going to take Canada. Having failed to take it in the American Revolution, this would be our second bite at the apple. And of course, Jefferson himself remarked that Canada was there merely for the marching.
Didn't quite work out that way. Peter, let me bring you in on this. In a lot of wars, somebody is usually seen as David and somebody is seen as Goliath. Who played those roles in this war?
Depends on who you are. If the United States, you're the small, plucky new republic facing the old tyranny of Britain, greatest empire of the world. They won't recognize your independence. They won't leave you alone. If you're in Canada, it's entirely different. Here you're facing the giant United States next door. This, which compared to what, still has 10 times their population.
And did back then.
And did back then. And from our perspective, it looks like they could just walk right over the border. And so for us, the war is all about being invaded again and again and again.
Rick, how about the First Nations at the time? Whom did they see as David and who did they see as Goliath?
I think they saw them two twins, two Goliath twins, and get caught between them. And in fact, Red Jacket even mentions that when he tries to make a plea or neutrality, that the Americans are our friends. We've lived next to them for centuries. And the great king across the ocean is our honored ally. And it was a tough choice to be made. But the fear was whoever won the war could crush us. So we had to try to decide who would look after our long-term interests the best, who would likely to win this war, and people made their choices accordingly.
And most Indians at the time went with the Brits, obviously.
Well, really it was about half and half. Well, it depends on where you go. Among the Six Nations, of course, all the Native nations have a different story about this war. But for us, it was pretty evenly split. And even some people at Grand River sided with the Americans. Some people over in New York sided with the British. So it was a very mixed bag and made it very difficult sometimes to know who you could trust.
Peter, let me revisit this issue of whether this was a civil war, as Alan Taylor describes in his book. Again, we learned in high school that they attacked us, Americans versus Canadians. There's nothing Civil War about that. Alan's put a different thesis on the table. What's your view on that?
Well, he's taken a broader look at the war. Instead of just looking at it how it appears in Canada or just how it appears in the United States, he tries to look at both groups and to look at it as one of the great English-speaking civil wars. Civil wars between the English-speaking peoples that start with the English Civil War and the American Revolution, War of 1812, finally the American Civil War. Certainly if you look at Canada, where the European population is mostly from the United States, you've got a very strong division between people who are willing to fight for the British, or at least fight for their homes, and people who go for the United States. So one of the first results of the war is refugees from Canada fleeing to the United States. And as you go on, you get more and more Canadians who sign up with the American forces, and eventually cause the American cause a huge amount of damage because they start raiding their former neighbors, turning people who might before have been lukewarm about the war into passionate British defenders, if only because this was the only way to protect your farm.
Let me pick up on that word damages, because Bill, I gather one of the reasons that this war ended when it did, without a kind of a dramatic surrender or anything like that, was that the U.S. Treasury was on the verge of running out of money. How expensive was this war for the U.S.?
Well, it wasn't that the war was so expensive, it's that the people weren't paying taxes. The war was terribly unpopular in New England. And at the time when the war was being waged, New England was the richest part of the Union. And so the reluctance, the refusal in some instances, of New England to support the war put a great strain on the rest of the country. The governor of Massachusetts, Caleb Strong, for example, refused to put Massachusetts militia under the command of regular army officers. So resources were available in America to fight this war, but the resources were not forthcoming from various parts of the country. I'd like to also comment on the Civil War thesis of Alan Taylor.
Sure.
Alan's intellectual construct here is very interesting and, of course, very useful. It's a very fine framework. But like so many historical frameworks, when you look at it more closely, it doesn't always hold together very well. And Allen's thesis of civil war, I think, works best along what he refers to, quite correctly refers to, as the borderlands. That is the area along the northern border between the United States and Canada, particularly along the Niagara frontier. And there I understand that it's quite clear that Native Americans, as well as Europeans, Anglo-Europeans, back and forth. But you know, the war was wider than that. And that framework doesn't hold down on the Gulf Coast, certainly doesn't hold down in New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, nor does it hold on the battle for the lakes, either on Lake Ontario or Lake Erie. And it certainly doesn't hold for the battle on the high seas, where the American Navy distinguished itself. So I think Allen's construct of civil war is interesting, very useful, but I'm not sure it applies generally to the entire, all of the campaigns in the war.
Okay, let's follow up on that by talking about one of the lingering controversies to this day, 200 years later, and that is, who won this thing? Rick, I think the conclusion that most people came to, they can argue whether it was America or Canada, but everybody agrees the Indian peoples of the day lost. Is there any controversy about that?
Not so much controversy, I guess it's a matter of perspective, because I would argue that we didn't lose on the battlefield, and we didn't sign articles of capitulation, and we didn't lose any land or rights or privileges as expressed in the treaty. So I wonder, in terms of the war itself, we didn't lose. Afterwards, the conduct of both the Americans and British agents created a very difficult situation for us. So it's not so much who won the war, but no matter what side claims that they won, they both treated us the same way, and they lusted after our land.
Yeah, I should have been clearer about that. You certainly didn't lose on the battlefield, but certainly politically, after the fact, it was a loss.
It's ironic that we were such a powerful force during the war. Not only this, but Revolutionary War and the French and Indian Wars. But as soon as we lost our ability to wield the tomahawk, we became a secondary power in this drama. Then all of a sudden, we lost our ability to defend our land. And I think our people changed too. Some people then said, well, if this is the future, maybe we better go with the flow. And that's exactly what Tecumseh was complaining about. Too many of our leaders were compromising, trying to get a good deal from either the British or the Americans, and in the end, the only deal they had was their land was taken. So in many ways, we continue to fight for that land. It's not a war, but it's a different kind of fight going on today, as it has been for centuries.
Tecumseh, would you agree, the greatest Indian leader of his day who perished during this war?
I would think a real great leader wouldn't have got killed, but I would say that he certainly is a great inspirational leader, but for most Native people, but most Native people don't really understand what he did and how he went about doing that. And it's easy to herald a fallen hero, and it's hard to recognize all of the nameless people who actually fought hard and built the peace and allowed our nation to survive. So he's just one of many important leaders during the War of 1812.
Bill, let me ask you, there in Boston, in the shadow of old Ironsides, not far away from that bridge that's right behind you, who won this war?
Correct. Well, you know, it's an interesting question. I always, when someone asks me that, I remember the words of Talleyrand, the French foreign minister who went through the French Revolution. At the end of the Revolution, someone asked Talleyrand, Monsieur Talleyrand, what did you do during the Revolution? And his response was, I survived. And I think that's probably what the United States can say most effectively, that we survived. It's very difficult for us to argue that we won. I don't think that's the case. And as you know, the Treaty of Ghent has simply established status quo ante bellum. Perhaps we did establish ourselves as a permanent republic, that's true, but it was hardly a great victory. It is somewhat ironic here in Boston, the home port of USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, the great heroine, the American heroine from this war, and we celebrate her. Yes, yet it is this very city, it is this very commonwealth that during the war didn't want to support the war, but now we certainly gather around Constitution. I'd also like to comment for a moment on Native peoples, because I think there is an interesting perspective here. As long as empires were at war in North America, the Native peoples could use their leverage. They could try to play one off against the other. Of course, in 1763, the French left, and the Native peoples lost that lever. And they were left in the hands then of the British Empire, the colonials and the British. Then, of course, the War of 1812, which more or less the British Empire, at least the Crown, abandons native peoples to the Americans, certainly on this side of the border, and I know less about Canadian history. And so I do think that the War of 1812 was another piece of this tragedy of what happens to the native peoples in North America as they are left increasingly in the hands of settlers, colonialists, Americans, or Canadians without the benefit of being able to seek help, assistance from one of the empires.
Peter, I've taken a tour of Old Ironsides numerous times, and the tour guides never fail to say that the Americans won that war, and that that ship that's still in that harbor in Boston, in Charleston, I guess, you know, would that it could tell the stories of those days 200 years ago. Are you prepared to put forward the notion that that's wrong and Canada, in fact, won this war?
Well, our whole exhibit at the Canadian War Museum is based on the premise that each participant fights their own war and succeeds or fails on their own terms. So for Canada, what I like to tell people is that if we had lost the war, if Britain had ceded Canada to the United States, I would be working at the Northern American War Museum, and our exhibit would be called the Canadian War of Liberation.
I see.
For Canadians, it's self-evident we won the war. For the Americans, though, they're fighting a broader war. All we care about is Canada, but the Americans are fighting across the North Atlantic world, really from the Mississippi to the English Channel. And as far as they're concerned, when they look at the war, they say, well, we stood up against the toughest empire in the world at the time. We forced them to respect us. We completed the work of the American Revolution.
So both sides can make a claim.
Both sides, and the British have their own perspectives. First of all, they don't care who won the war. But what they care deeply about is that they won their war with Napoleonic France and didn't lose Canada while they were at it.
Right. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock, I'm going to play a little piece of tape here. Alan Gregg, my friend, has got an interview with the York University political scientist James Laxer on his new book, Tecumseh and Brock, two of the great heroes of that war. Tecumseh, of course, for the Indian Confederacy of the time, and Brock, General Isaac Brock, who was killed at Queenston Heights just a few months after this war started. Here's a clip from the interview, then we're going to come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
This war for Upper Canada is our war of independence. And as the kind of crazy people that we are, our two biggest heroes in the war, neither of them is Canadian. Tecumseh's not Canadian, doesn't want to be Canadian. Brock isn't Canadian, doesn't want to be Canadian. They're both fighting. Tecumseh's fighting for to create a native state. Brock is fighting to defend the British Empire. And yet they emerge as enormous figures in our history.
Given the way, Rick, that James has described the players
Steve,
here
I
and what they were
say,
fighting for, stand by for a sec, Bill, can you really say that this was a Canadian victory?
Right, I think that's, in retrospect, we like to draw from history those things that make us feel most comfortable about the regrets we have. So I think looking at that, who won or who lost this war is going to be an endless debate. There certainly were political objectives achieved on all sides, and I think even the native nations, even though we didn't get the big unified confederacy that Tecumseh and later Red Jacket had hoped for, and the British couldn't negotiate for that in the treaty, the fact is that the native nations are respected as sovereign nations in the United States. Here in Canada, it's a little different. They view us as dependent, like a domestic unit, dependent upon the larger confederation. So we still have a long way to go to get back to the kind of alliance we had, nation-to-nation alliance that entered the war. And even though the treaty kind of guaranteed those rights, the reality is the ball was dropped on that matter.
Bill, I'd be interested in your take. Tecumseh was clearly fighting for his fellow native Canadians, if I can put it that way. Isaac Brock was clearly fighting for the British Empire. This notion of fighting for Canada wasn't even there yet. So does Canada have any business even trying to claim victory in this?
Well, I think that certainly Canada can claim victory. That in the sense that they did turn back the American invasions. Of that, there's no question. They defeated us. I suppose that is simply the truth. They defeated us. So in that sense, we failed. If our objective was to conquer Canada, and that certainly was one of the objectives, I believe, then we failed in that objective. They turned us back, and we lost that battle.
Peter, how about this notion that most of this war took place You know, the biggest city in Canada at the time was Quebec City. The war didn't go there. Montreal was the second biggest city. That barely saw any action. Most of this war was fought on the north and south shores of Lake Ontario, western New York. You know, they blew up our capital. We blew up theirs. Was this really a British North American war, or was this more of an Ontario conflict?
Oh, it's definitely British North American. When people ask me, what's the most important battle of the War of 1812? I always say, it's the battle that was never fought, the American siege of Quebec City.
Right.
Quebec City, where the British received troops, supplies, munitions from Britain, is the one point that Britain has to hold and the United States has to take if either one is going to win the war. Halifax is a hugely important naval base for the British, where they based their blockade of the northern part of the eastern seaboard of the United States. So most of the fighting does take place in southern Ontario and southwestern Quebec, but there are important sites for the war all across what is then Canada.
Okay, let's go into the aftermath of the war here, and I want to talk about the long-term consequences. A couple of weeks ago, a guy by the name of Doug Saunders, who's a columnist in the Globe and Mail, Bill, that's our national newspaper here in Canada, one of them anyway, recounted a story that his great-grandmother, Catherine, described on a night when men broke into her house demanding weapons. And here is what he wrote. As we mark the 200th anniversary of the war's beginning this week, we should pay far more attention to what happened after its end. It was the decades-long victory dance, not the war itself, that really shaped Canada. Judging by my ancestors, he writes, it's hard not to conclude that winning the war was the worst thing ever to happen to this country. The events that Catherine describes took place in Brantford, Ontario, during part of what became known as the 1837 rebellions. That fast-quashed series of democratic uprisings that flashed across Upper and Lower Canada for a year, but for most people of the British colonies, they were simply the latest extension of an undeclared civil war that had begun in 1812 and had become only more urgent and personal as the years wore on. Let's go around on this. Peter, do you agree that the War of 1812 really didn't end in 1815?
Well, personally, I would say that the winners are neither the right and the family compact or the radical reformers. They're the moderate reformers, like Baldwin and LaFontaine, who bring in responsible government. There is an enormous appeal in Canada for the British connection, yes, but they want the British connection with British liberties, British form of democracy. And the people who ultimately win are the people who seek nonviolent political power.
Rick, what's your view on that? That the war didn't really end in 15, it went on a lot longer.
I think it still continues. Every time I see a new Walmart coming up, I wonder who won the war. When the iPhone replaces the BlackBerry, you got to ask who's winning the war. So I think American culture and the biases that it has are influencing the Canadian lifestyle to a more significant degree than we may want to admit.
We're laughing, but you're making a significant point here.
Yeah, so that in the end, they have a pervasive way of getting you over to their side. And I think that's what happened to a lot of our people trying to make up our mind. Do we assimilate and acculturate to their form of lifestyle, which is what Jefferson and even Washington wanted for us, to be farmers like them? Or do we try to maintain a way of life that was based upon a very old connection to the land? And so when we tried to wrestle with the legacy of this battle, we're still fighting it. In a sense, we're still fighting for our right to be us on our own land under our own law. And but that's been the fight ever since 1492.
Bill, I wonder from an American point of view whether you folks think that this war in fact ended in New Orleans in 1815.
I think this war is an epic event, not in and of itself, but because what it symbolizes. You know, since the moment Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence, for the next several hundred years, it was an unsettled question as to who would be dominant in the North American continent, who would live here permanently, who would have control. The War of 1812 settles that issue finally after centuries. And the settlement is that the United States and Canada, Great Britain, will jointly occupy this continent, and that the native peoples who have been here will be sidelined, will be, as much as these powers can, pushed aside. It creates 100 years of peace. Peace on the North Atlantic from 1814, 1815 till 1914. It ushers in this period of amicability between the United States and Great Britain, to include Canada here. It allows these nations to develop in this aura of peace in a phenomenal economic advantage. Trade, immigration, etc., etc. These two nations, the United States and Canada, grow and prosper, and so too does the British Empire. So the War of 1812, while in and of itself is a somewhat minor occurrence, I suppose, in world history, does in fact, I think, mark that moment when once and for all we know we're going to live together on this continent, and we will do it peacefully. And we have done that peacefully. Right after the war, we begin to settle our boundary disputes. The Great Lakes, armed vessels are prohibited from the Great Lakes. We engage in reciprocity treaties with Canada, with Great Britain. So the War of 1812 does end this centuries-long question about who is going to be in control of North America.
But let's do a little what if here, Rick, because clearly I think the vision of the day was that the so-called Canadians would be on the northern part of this continent, the Americans would control what they had at the time and perhaps the west of the United States today. But Indian people at the time envisaged an Indian confederacy around, I guess, Michigan, Ohio, that part of the United States. If things had unfolded the way you wanted, how would the map look different today?
When you look at what could have been possible if we were able to form a unified response to Western expansion, be it British or American or Spanish or French, I mean, we might have been able to forestall maybe the inevitable, because the numbers just don't work in our favor. No matter how big the United States was, it's this big consuming machine. In fact, in our language, we call it this huge serpent with an insatiable appetite. That's the United States, and it's going to keep on going. So maybe it was a fantasy to think we could create this native barrier that's going to stop here. But it wasn't just our fantasy. In fact, if you look at history, kind of even starts, the Six Nations were the first barrier state. We were supposed to be the ground between civilization and savagery. Then it moves to the Ohio Valley. Then it moves to Oklahoma, now further west. So that's the legacy of history, is that this forward movement was predicated upon the spiritual beliefs of the Europeans, the sense of destiny. And I guess that's the sad part, is that even the treaties they made, that are, like are shown in these replicas that I have here, were supposed to guarantee a certain kind of alliance for that future. And ultimately that got betrayed. So you could ask the same question: can you win a war and still lose your honor? And at least in how the British, the Crown, and then the Canadian officials and the United States dealt with the native nations, you could say it was a question of honor at stake.
I just wonder if we can get to a wider shot on the table here, because you explain what those are that you brought.
Well, this belt here is called the Covenant Chain. This actually goes back to, when you think about it, 1677. The Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, have a longer relationship with the Crown than either Canada or the United States. And that relationship is what got us into the war. This figure represents the king, this represents our people. Whenever he wanted our attention, he'd shake that chain all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. We'd turn, look to Europe and said, now what do you want? And he usually wanted more land or more warriors. At the end of the war, William Claus delivered this wampum belt as a tribute to our involvement in the war, but he also said that the Crown promises not to interfere in our culture and our government. Well, we both know they didn't do too good on that pledge. So what we're saying, in the next 200 years, maybe we should focus in on the pledges made. What is possible that we can restore a sacred and profound relationship, a political relationship between all of the parties.
Peter, with just a minute to go here, those belts belie what the conventional wisdom around this war is. You ask anybody, what's the legacy of the War of 1812? And the usual answer is, you know, almost 200 years of peaceful relations between Canadians and Americans. But that doesn't take into account the stories of those two belts, does it?
Well, no, as Dr. Fowler mentioned, once the British and United States more or less agree to get along, the military value of native allies declines immediately. And the British then almost literally turn on their allies. And instead of asking for help in war, start asking for more and more land, gradually eroding their resource base.
I want to thank all three of you for coming in tonight and helping us with this discussion. 200 years to the month after the War of 1812 began. Bill Fowler from Northeastern University in Boston. It's so nice to hear that accent in the north part of Boston.
Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you so much. Peter McLeod from the Canadian War
Thank you.
Museum, and Rick Hill from the Six Nations Legacy Consortium. My thanks to all three of you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.